Today, a new moon is in the sky, a 23-inch metal sphere placed in orbit by a Russian rocket.
The 1957 launch of Sputnik staggered America.
You are hearing the actual signals transmitted by the Earth-circling satellite.
Sputnik was an awesome achievement that underscored the Soviets' leadership in space technology. By comparison, America's rocket program suffered continuing setbacks. Again, in 1961, the Soviets prevailed. Cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first man in space. The president refused to fall behind the communists in the space race. He challenged the nation to catch the Soviets and go beyond.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
Congress approved $20 billion for the space program. One year later, John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth. The success propelled the space program forward, and on July 20th, 1969, John F. Kennedy's dream came true.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Millions of Americans watched as astronaut Neil Armstrong became the first person to walk on the moon. It was a glowing moment of American achievement. But the technology that could launch a man into orbit could also carry nuclear warheads across continents or oceans. And from the small island of Cuba, the threat of a nuclear missile strike trapped President Kennedy in the most frightening challenge of the Cold War. Just weeks after entering the Oval Office, Kennedy gave the go-ahead to a CIA plan to invade the island of Cuba and overthrow the communist government of Fidel Castro. The mission, which became known as the Bay of Pigs, was a disaster and tarnished the new administration. 1 year later, in October 1962, U.S. spy planes revealed Soviet nuclear missile bases in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev had sent the missiles intending to protect Castro's fledgling regime and send a message to America: do not invade Cuba. The Cuban Missile Crisis triggered a state of emergency. Some advisors called for a preemptive airstrike or invasion of the island. But if attacked, would Khrushchev respond with nuclear weapons? Kennedy addressed the American public. He said that ships bound for Cuba with military equipment would be quarantined. And he issued a warning.
We will not prematurely or unnecessarily risk the course of worldwide nuclear war, in which even the fruits of victory would be ashes in our mouth. But neither will we shrink from that risk at any time it must be faced.
The two superpowers stood toe-to-toe.
I'd hate like heck to see us go to war, but if it's necessary to prevent a nuclear war, I think the action has to be taken at this time.
Well, I think it's high time we stopped Russia from having things her own way.
I know that some action should be taken, but he's going to have to tread very lightly, short of war.
In this charged atmosphere, the smallest mistake at any level could lead to an all-out nuclear war. For 11 days, Americans worried, waited, and wondered if they would see tomorrow. Finally, on October 28th, after much diplomacy and back-channel negotiations, the situation was diffused. The Soviets would withdraw their missiles from Cuba. In return, President Kennedy publicly agreed that he would not invade the island. Privately, he also conceded to the removal of U.S. medium-range missiles from Turkey. The Cuban Missile Crisis was John F. Kennedy's gravest foreign policy challenge, but it wasn't his only one. In 1961, the divided city of Berlin was the issue. Khrushchev said the Soviets would cut off access between the Communist East and the Democratic West. East Berlin was losing as many as 1,500 people per day, many of whom were well-educated and skilled workers. Khrushchev had to stop the flow. The Soviets built the Berlin Wall, 96 miles of concrete isolating east from west. Since the Soviets took no military action against West Berlin, the president could only protest. A disheartened Kennedy stated that it's not a very nice solution, but a wall is a hell of a lot better than a war. In the newly divided city, the president denounced communist oppression.
And there are even a few who say that it's true that communism is an evil system, but it permits us to make economic progress. Lass sie nach Berlin kommen. Let them come to Berlin. All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
Communist expansion was also a challenge to Kennedy in Southeast Asia, where conflicts dating back to the Eisenhower administration flared. In Laos, President Kennedy reluctantly accepted a coalition government that included communists. In neighboring Vietnam, however, Kennedy and his advisors set the country on a course that would consume 20 years, more than 50,000 American lives, and ultimately forced many to question the trust they placed in their political leaders. Conflicts in Asia and elsewhere aggravated the Cold War rivalry, but Kennedy and Khrushchev, both men deeply shaken by the nuclear threat of the Cuban Missile Crisis, agreed to work together to bring about the Limited Test Ban Treaty. Signed in Moscow by the United States, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain, the treaty prohibited atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons. It was a small step, but started a collaborative process that would be used throughout the Cold War. Kennedy espoused social justice, but he remained reluctant to touch civil rights. His rhetoric promoting citizen activism could only last so long. He would soon be forced to take a stand. In the early 60s, social unrest grew as student volunteers or freedom riders took bus trips throughout the South, testing segregation laws for interstate travel facilities and drawing a sometimes violent response from the Ku Klux Klan. In 1962, James Meredith, the first African-American student at the all-white University of Mississippi, was barred from entering. Federal marshals were sent to protect Meredith from threats of lynching. Then, Kennedy sent federal troops to Mississippi after riots broke out, leaving 2 dead and hundreds injured. 1963 marked a pivotal year for civil rights. In April, Martin Luther King Jr. began a series of peaceful demonstrations in Birmingham, Alabama, where the police met peaceful marchers with fire hoses and dogs. But at Brother Bobby's urging, Kennedy committed himself to racial equality.
If we're wrong, why don't you arrest us?
In too many parts of the country, wrongs are inflicted on Negro citizens, and there are no remedies at law.
We're willing to be beaten for democracy, and you misuse democracy in the street. You beat people bloody in order that they will not have the privilege to vote.
As clashes grew more violent, civil rights leaders pressed Kennedy for legislation.
Those who do nothing are inviting shame as well as violence. Those who act boldly are recognizing right as well as reality.
In late 1963, the president submitted a bill.
Next week, I shall ask the Congress of the United States to act, to make a commitment it has not fully made in this century to the proposition that race has no place in American life or law.
And on August 28, 1963, some 250,000 people joined the March on Washington, D.C. in support of Kennedy's Civil Rights Bill, one of the largest demonstrations to date.
I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
Still, Congress dragged its feet, and no action was taken. Kennedy believed he could move civil rights forward. With a 60% approval rating, the president looked ahead to a second term in which he would renew his commitment to end racial injustice and fight poverty. He would also reconsider the future course of America's involvement in Vietnam. On November 22, 1963, the president and his wife waved to cheering crowds in Dallas, Texas. Shots rang out from the Texas School Book Depository.
Bulletin had just come in from Dallas. A sniper, armed with a high-powered rifle, murdered President Kennedy today. Lyndon Johnson has taken the oath of office as the 37th President of the United States.
A single gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald, was arrested for the murder. 2 days later, Oswald himself was shot by nightclub owner Jack Ruby. 2 years later, an official government investigation concluded that Oswald acted alone. But many unanswered questions continue to stir controversy. The nation mourned their youthful leader, his optimism and seeming invincibility. His promises of reform fell victim to an unfinished life. An estimated 1 million people lined the streets from the Capitol to Arlington Cemetery, adding to Kennedy's legacy as a martyred president. Much of the fallen president's vision for America was shared by the new man in the White House, Lyndon Baines Johnson. Johnson would enjoy success building on Kennedy's domestic accomplishments, but he would fail to escape the destructive power of Vietnam.